All right, hey everybody, let's do this. We rolling? Great, how's my hair? Good afternoon, everybody. It's Wednesday, April 15th, 2026. It's a little after 1 o'clock. This is the Charter Review Special Committee. I am Ryan Dorsey, the chair of the committee and representative of the city's 3rd Council District. I am joined today by Vice Chair of the committee, Councilman Dr. John Bullock of the 9th District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To his left, Councilman Zach Blanchard of the 11th District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To my far right, Councilman Jermaine Jones of the 12th District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To his left, Councilwoman Odette Ramos of the 14th District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And to my immediate right, Mr. Ethan Navarre, the staff to the committee from the Office of Council Services. How are you today, Ethan?
Doing wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. We have representatives from all the agencies that the bill we're here for was referred to. We are also joined by some folks in the public. We have folks online as well, and other folks from council offices and council president's office. We are here today for the hearing on Council Bill 260172, Charter Amendment, Charter Committee Recommendations. This committee has been convening since October of last year with the directive to review the city charter and consider amendments that should be made both in the short term and in the long term to see what we can prepare for the 2026 election and continue this work beyond this initial endeavor to think big for things that will take a little longer to prepare for the 2028 election. Through many months of reading and discussion, deliberation, and laying on the table every single topic for consideration that any person brought to us as something to be considered. We have landed on a set of recommendations that we would like the City Council to consider and have asked for agencies to report on, and have received reports from all those agencies. We will also hear from the Mayor's Office of Government Relations, who's going to be turning in a report to us. I think rather than go through all of the bill myself as just like an overview of the whole thing, what I would like to do is go first to our bill reports. I think for anybody who is watching now, we will, in the course of our discussion, I think we will cover all of the different topics of proposed change in here if you're interested in following along at home. We will begin with the mayor's office. I want to note also that we had participation throughout this process in every one of our meetings from the mayor's office, the comptroller's office, the law department, and the Department of Legislative Reference. And this was of great value in our deliberative process and our ability to consider things and to stoke all kinds of conversations. And so I want to first give thanks to those folks for participating. And we will go to those folks who are here today who participated throughout this process before going on to the other agencies that reported on the bill. We have already requested a number of amendments ourselves and have received amendments or requests from certain agencies. And when we get to Department of Legislative Reference, who was not asked to report on the bill, but again, is an indispensable part of this process here. Ben will just kind of attest to having a repository of these amendment requests. Mr. Vice Chair, does that sound good? We're going to go over to the mayor's office.
Sounds great.
Oh, great. Okay, we will go to Mr. Tyler Schnella from the Mayor's Office of Government Relations.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Tyler Schnella, and I serve as the Deputy Director of Government Relations for Mayor Scott. I want to begin by thanking you for your work in putting forward this package of charter amendments. We recognize the level of thought and effort that has gone into these proposals, and we appreciate any efforts to strengthen how city government functions. The administration shares the committee's interest in ensuring that our charter reflects a government that is effective, accountable, and responsive to the needs of city residents. Several provisions in this package advance those goals and align with the core pillar of the Scott administration, making city government more effective. First, we support the creation of a new budget article by moving the budget process out of the Board of Estimates article. The budget is one of the most significant policy and fiscal tools available to the city, and elevating it to its own article provides residents, businesses, and those evaluating city operations with greater clarity around how our budget process works. We also support removing the current $1 million cap on the contingency fund. The cap does not reflect the scale or complexity of modern city operations and can unnecessarily constrain the administration's ability to respond to emergent needs, emergencies, and unforeseen costs in a timely manner. In addition, we support decoupling the revenue ordinance, specifically the tax rate, from the passage of the ordinance of estimates. This change reflects the practical reality that the property tax must be established in advance of the budget to meet external deadlines. We are also supportive of removing the administrative minutia from the charter with regard to procurement. The charter should establish broad governing principles, not prescribe operational details that are better suited for the code or administrative regulations. This change is directly aligned with the administration's procurement transformation plan. We also support removing the Board of Estimates from the preliminary budget process and transmitting the mayor's preliminary budget directly to the city council. However, we are offering an amendment to require the preliminary budget be delivered on or before April 30th to account for the timing of state budget actions and to ensure the city's proposal reflects the most current fiscal information. And the Department of Planning will share more about an amendment around the capital budget with respect to additions from the state budget. Finally, we support removing the requirement for a Board of Estimates hearing for minor privilege matters. This is a common sense change that reduces administrative burden and allows the board to focus on higher impact decisions while still ensuring appropriate review processes are in place so that residents can get the approvals they need. Again, I want to commend you for your work on these proposals, which we believe will make city government more effective and responsive to residents' needs. At the same time, there are provisions within this package that raise concern for the administration. These proposals will alter the responsibilities of government established in the charter in ways that could potentially undermine the city's ability to operate efficiently and execute policy effectively in the future. In order to address the concerns we have, but maintain our eagerness to partner with the committee to advance our shared interests in improving the charter, we will offer amendments to the committee for consideration. I will walk through our thinking on these concerns and what we believe will be able to address them. So I want to begin with the proposed changes to the mayor's veto timeline. The administration does not support shortening the mayor's time for final action on legislation or the budget. The veto timeline is a crucial logistical component of the legislative process. While Mayor Scott has exercised his veto authority only twice in more than 5.5 years, there have been several instances or a few instances where legislation needed to be returned to the council for correction. Every mayoral administration needs time to thoroughly review legislation, assess legal and operational impacts, and make informed decisions about whether to sign or veto a bill on behalf of the residents of this city. Limiting the mayor's timeline while extending the council's time to act creates an imbalance in the process that offers no operational benefit. Rather, it introduces the possibility for less considered and responsible decision-making that could undermine the quality of future actions taken by both the council and the mayor. In raising these concerns, we respectfully will note our opposition to this amendment. Next, the administration also has concerns about the proposal to allow the council to place conditions on the release of appropriations. Introducing conditions on the release of appropriated funds opens the door to uncertainty, delays implementation, and risks disrupting the delivery of essential services. Most importantly, it creates the opportunity for future abuse of this power. While we are deeply grateful for the partnership with the current council and the integrity-driven approach the current council takes, these charter amendments will govern the action of all future councils. We have to address how each of these changes could be misapplied in the future by less virtuous individuals, rather than how it could be used positively by the current council trying to do the right thing on behalf of residents. We have seen that very situation play out at the federal level, where a politically motivated administration has tested the boundaries of impoundment and dramatically slashed programming that is funded and required by law. Our residents have borne the cost of that action. Under this proposed amendment, we have to consider how this will function in practice, especially under the worst circumstances rather than the best. Who determines whether a condition has been met and on what standard? What happens when a condition is placed on appropriations for one reason, but withheld to extract concessions on a completely different issue behind closed doors? The implications are not just procedural, they are financial. Delays in releasing funds could jeopardize the city's ability to meet deadlines tied to grants, matching funds, or our ability to meet debt obligations. This alone could endanger the city's bond rating and cause broader economic impact. In those cases, the cost is not theoretical, it is real dollars that the city risks losing. Finally, I want to address the proposal to allow the creation of non-lapsing funds by ordinance. The charter currently provides an important safeguard by requiring that non-lapsing funds be established through a charter amendment, and for good reason. These funds are not routine. They carry long-term fiscal impacts. By design, non-lapsing funds require ongoing mandatory appropriations each fiscal year, and any unspent funds do not revert back to the general fund and cannot be reallocated to meet other needs. For that reason, these funds should remain rare, deliberate, and subject to the higher standards that the charter requires, opening the door to the proliferation of non-lapsing restricted funds would further constrain the council and the administration's ability to respond to emerging priorities, address urgent needs, and close budget gaps. This would also undermine the integrity of our budget process. There are also broader financial implications. The accumulation of non-lapsing funds could be viewed negatively by our credit rating agencies, as it reduces budget flexibility and signals less control over long-term fiscal planning. For these reasons, the administration does not support including this provision in the proposed amendment that will be put forth to the voters. I want to close by reiterating the administration's gratitude for your commitment to improving the charter and strengthening the operations of city government. As you can see from both the provisions we support and the explanation for those we would like to amend or remove from the proposed amendment, we all share the same goal of ensuring that Baltimore city government constantly evolves to function better and meet good governance best practice. We look forward to working with you to ensure the final package of proposals meets the needs of residents now and in the years to come. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And you'll be sending us a written report?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Let's go to the Comptroller's office.
Good afternoon. Sorry, talking a lot today. Casey Kelleher, Deputy Chief of Staff for the Office of the Comptroller. We submitted a bill report and structured it a little bit differently than my colleagues. Rather than getting into every part of the bill, our comments are just pertaining to the pieces that affect us, so I'll go into that now. The Office of the Comptroller is supportive of all the provisions that expand the council's ability to deliberate over the budget. We believe enhancing the council's deliberative role strengthens accountability and ensures that those representatives have the time necessary to conduct thorough fiscal oversight on behalf of Baltimore residents. If the current budget structure remains unchanged, specifically if responsibility for drafting the budget doesn't revert back to the comptroller, as he's spoken to many of you about, and the composition of the board is not modified, then it's really not necessary for the Board of Estimates to receive the budget. I understand a complete removal of that is in progress, and the Office of the Comptroller is supportive of just sending the budget straight to council. We do offer an amendment if that change doesn't happen, if the budget stays with going to the board. That just clarifies the public hearing piece, and that's on page 2 of our report. Secondly, minor privileges. Regarding restructuring minor privileges, future legislation should incorporate a clear and accessible appeals process. Minor privileges applications constitute real property transactions that permit private use of the public right-of-way. As such, the Baltimore City Board of Estimates has historically provided a public forum through which proposed uses may be reviewed, protested, and where appropriate, modified. These real property uses, fees, and processes should have codified protection and transparent processes, especially as it relates to commercial uses of the public right-of-way. I can think of 3 different real estate transactions we're working on right now where we've used the transparency of the Board of Estimates process to make business owners consider their actions on their neighbors. So I just want to say that a public process is really necessary. We offer another amendment that we consider very small on the back, on the second page that references page 22, line 18, relating to promulgating rules and regulations. Our reason is that the Board of Estimates needs to be the governing body of city procurement and capital contracts, and thus must have the duty and responsibility of promulgating regulations that take into account the needs of all agencies. As it's written as a shall is a little bit more is permissive, but stronger language will ensure a comprehensive approach is taken. Every few months, a city agency tries to promulgate their own rules and regs that affect other agencies deeply, and it is only the threat of the fact that these things have to be approved by a Board of Estimates do we get to pull city agencies out of their silo and make sure that they work with their appropriate sister agencies on promulgating rules that everyone can work with. So we just want, and we also just believe it is the board's duty as the entity in charge of fiscal policy that they should be promulgating rules and regs to govern their operations. So we offer that amendment to the committee. Otherwise, we request a favorable report on City Council Bill 260172 and really commend the committee for taking this charter review seriously and detailed. Thank you.
Thank you. Law Department.
Thank you, Chair Dorsey. Jeff Hochstetler with the Law Department. As noted in our bill report, law can approve the charter amendment resolution for form and legal sufficiency with the relatively minor suggested amendments as noted in the report.
Great, and I've reviewed the Law Department's report for these amendments. They are fairly minor in general. Does the committee want Law to go through their amendments here and now? If they're for basic form and legal sufficiency things. Jeff, do you want to do a quick run through them?
Yeah, I can do that. So the first one has to do...
Can you pull the mic a little closer to you, please?
Yeah, sure thing. The first one has to do with the timing of the budget and the veto and veto override process. We recommend that there should be a new subsection that explicitly states that the ordinance of estimates must be adopted no later than the beginning of the fiscal year, notwithstanding the process for veto and override stated elsewhere. There's the possibility of continuing ambiguity about how veto and veto override process would work We've always interpreted the backstop of budget needing to be enacted by the beginning of the fiscal year as a very hard deadline for that process to play out. So simply making that explicit in the charter would help overcome that ambiguity. And if the other amendments related to veto, override, and budget timing are adopted, there should be time for the process to play out by the beginning of the fiscal year.
I'll just say, I know that I've asked you this question myself and can only imagine that other council members in the past and current and future will continue to ask about this, what happens with the veto override when it comes to the new fiscal year. And this lack of explicit statement about it just needs, results in people coming back to the law department again and again and again and saying, can you explain this to us? And they say, well, it's our interpretation. Rather, it would be, I think, easier for everybody
Correct.
if there was a just clear statement. Thank you.
The second amendment has to do with the new explicit authority saying that nothing in the charter will prevent the creation of non-lapsing funds by ordinance or the dedication of revenue sources to those funds also by ordinance. We recommend simply adding to that statement. So right now, and I'll read it, it's the proposed section 8 on page 14, non-lapsing funds. Nothing in this charter prevents the establishment of non-lapsing funds by ordinance or the dedication of revenue sources to such funds by ordinance. We're recommending that there be an additional clause saying at the end for appropriation in the ordinance of estimates or a supplemental appropriation. The reason there just better reflects the budgetary reality as we understand it, that if there is a dedicated revenue source to a non-lapsing fund, that is already sort of a calculated top line revenue source in the ordinance of estimates, and the money is then actually appropriated for the approved purposes in the ordinance of estimates. So it's not as if the money goes into the fund in the ordinance of estimates itself. So we simply wanted to clarify that the appropriation from those funds still happens in either the ordinance of estimates or in supplemental appropriation bills, because those are the only two appropriation ordinances that currently exist in the charter. And with that is the second proposal to delete language on page 9, which basically it's the part about the council being able to cut amounts from the ordinance of estimates. Right now, there was an addition saying council cannot cut amounts dedicated to non-lapsing funds by ordinance, but based on the budgetary reality that the fund, that money isn't actually appropriated into those funds in the ordinance of estimates, that doesn't make sense. If the council was going to actually change or cut a dedicated revenue source, it would just do so by amending the ordinance that dedicated that revenue source. There wouldn't be a way to cut that dedicated funding in the ordinance of estimates itself. The council could still cut proposed appropriations that are coming from that fund if they don't like the purpose it's going to, but that's not the place where the dedicated revenue source itself would be appropriated. And then very minor, there's the new clause in section 5B3, specifically stating the city council can insert provisions conditional in the ordinance of estimates, making appropriations conditional on certain action. The other place where that's mentioned uses the word contingent, so we're just saying make both of those instances conditional for consistency. And then the last suggestion, so currently it exists in near the procurement section of Article 6. Section 10 right now states that no city officers or employees can be retained unless there are funds appropriated in the ordinance of estimates or there are other already appropriated funds for hiring. We recommended the committee consider keeping that language in. Hiring is a sort of unique situation where there could be promises made to hire someone, the full amount of the salary is paid out over time. It could result in the instance of an agency going above the appropriations that had been given to them. So simply, we're recommending the committee consider keeping this in as a sort of a hard budgetary stop to make sure that the city workforce is fully funded at the beginning and not allowing hiring to sort of go above appropriations. And those are the amendments suggested
And
by
the
law.
last thing that you have
Do we have one more here? Oh, sorry about that.
is about the effective date.
Yes. So currently, there are two provisions about effective dates. One is that all of the provisions that are being repealed will go into effect either the earlier of the next general election, so roughly 2 years after adoption, or until an ordinance is enacted on that subject matter. So in effect, that gives the council 2 years to enact ordinances that would cover what would be repealed from the charter before that repeal takes place. And then Section 4 says anything not covered in that earlier section would become effective January 1st. We simply pointed out that unless there's a good reason to have January 1st as the effective date, it could just mirror the language in the Maryland Constitution, Section 5, Article 11A, that says charter amendments or provisions once passed by the voters are adopted in the charter 30 days after the election, so you could make those effective upon adoption. But again, if you want January 1st, that's okay, but unless there's a good reason, it could just mirror the constitutional language.
Thank you. DLR, we did not ask you to report on the bill, but you've been an integral part of this process from day one, and just wanted to give you a moment here to just say where things are. I know that you've become the repository now of these amendment requests from various folks and are working on that. Can you just say a little something for us? You're the man behind the curtain, I know, but you're out here now.
Ben Guthorn with Legislative Reference. We are in receipt of all of the various amendment requests that have been provided through agency reports. It's our goal to provide those to be circulated before, I believe, next week's hearings for consideration with the same group again. With respect to the broader process or anything particular in the bill, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I don't have any statement to make at this time.
Great. Thank you. I just, before we go on to the other agencies, I just again want to say thanks to the four of you and your respective branches and agencies for being a consistent presence in our many meetings over these last 5 months, 6 months, and that it is, I think, a testament to the collaborative process that we undertook, that law has relatively few concerns over the language and little tweaks here to clean things up a little bit. There was just a lot of back and forth at every point in this process, and it was a real pleasure, actually, to conduct these hearings in the Reeves room around the table and just have a conversational tone to it. I think it was really helpful, and it was I think a new and unique experience for me in any kind of committee process. And so, again, I just want to thank everybody for being a consistent participant and presence and contributor in all of these. We'll go on to the rest of our agency reports, and then we'll have committee comments, questions, and we'll have some dialogue here. Let's go to the planning department.
Good afternoon, Sarah Parnellum from the Baltimore City Department of Planning. The bill was referred to the Planning Commission for comment, but hearings for the bill couldn't be scheduled prior to this hearing. So I'm providing comments on behalf of staff from the Department of Planning. So we had comments related to the amendments in the capital budget section as we provide a leadership role in preparing the city's capital budget. So we have three areas that we wanted to talk about. The current charter requires the Department of Finance to submit the ordinance of estimates at least 45 days before the start of the fiscal year and to provide additional 30 days public notice prior to that submission. The proposed amendment would eliminate the separate public notice requirement and instead require submission of a final ordinance of estimates to the City Council by April 15th. We're recommending changing that from April 15th to April 30th. The second item is that the charter specifies that the capital budget portion of the ordinance of estimates should reflect the recommendations of the Planning Commission and cannot include projects that were not recommended by the Planning Commission. Each year, the Department of Planning, rather than the Planning Commission, submits updates to the Board of Estimates based on the state budget and other new information that becomes available after Planning Commission makes its initial recommendations. And given the charter's intent to have the Planning Commission provide capital budget recommendations, the Department of Planning proposes an amendment to the charter that would allow Planning Commission to submit additional capital budget recommendations to the council after the ordinance of estimates is introduced to reflect the state budget and other new information that becomes available. And so we've provided some draft language for that amendment. And then the third item is that the bill includes a provision allowing the council to add conditions for agencies to receive funding. And the Department of Planning relies on timely and predictable access to appropriated funds to deliver our own department services, ranging from land use review and regulation, sustainability programs, community planning, historic preservation, food policy, capital budgeting, many more programs. In addition to that, we know that all of the agencies that receive capital funds also rely on timely access to appropriated funds to execute the capital projects. So project planning and project delivery would experience significant delays and significant risks if there were conditions placed on that funding, which would significantly increase, I think, the total project costs, which is something that none of us want to see. So we recommend removing the language for those conditions on funding. And with those three amendments, we have a favorable recommendation on the proposed amendments to the charter. Thank you.
Vice Chair.
I know you just mentioned it, and thank you, Sarah, for going over that. But again, the rationale for the change from April 15th to April 30th, because I know we've heard that before, but can you just reiterate that?
Yeah, so we have to consider changes for new information that we get after the Planning Commission has made the recommendation. So for example, this year session didn't end in Annapolis until April 10th. And then we need to work with the Mayor's Office of Government Relations to do analysis of the state budget and reflect that in the capital budget recommendations. And what we're proposing here is that those would go back to the Planning Commission so that they're providing recommendations that include those state budget recommendations. So it's allowing time for us to go through that process.
Okay.
Just a quick correction, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Just that session ended on April 13th.
Thank you. We received separate, it was referred to finance, but we received separate reports from finance and procurement. Bob, are you going to speak to both, or?
I'm going to speak to the budget ones.
Okay,
If you want me to go first, I can speak to those.
sure, finance.
Sure. So, good afternoon, everybody. Bob Sanamy, Deputy Finance Director. I was going to speak to the submissions about the budget. Tylor had hit on some of these points earlier, but just wanted to go through each of the key areas of change and express our support and some amendments and some of those ones that we have concerns about. I would start by saying we definitely appreciate this process. There's a lot of things that we have always, when we go through the budget process, think, wow, wouldn't it be much easier if the charter was different? And I'll mention some of those in these comments. So the first category is just around the budget timeline, what we were just referring to. The current charter requires the ordinance to be submitted 45 days before the end of the fiscal year. And then it also requires 30 days prior to that for us to release a preliminary budget. And our feedback on that is that having two budgets, having a preliminary budget and a final budget, doesn't really add much value in my experience. It leads us to having to do two publications, a preliminary budget publication and a final executive summary publication that are largely duplicative. It's almost all the same material. That earlier deadline for the preliminary budget requires us to do a formal Board of Estimates briefing. And I can say in my experience, we privately brief the members of the board before the budget comes out. And so doing a public briefing of the board doesn't really generate additional content or questions. And then we also do the taxpayers night after the release of the preliminary budget. But we do a whole series of community engagement events during the year to solicit input from the public on the budget. So having that earlier preliminary budget and then a final budget, having really two releases, in our mind, doesn't really add much value. So we are definitely behind the idea of just having one final deadline. On that final deadline, the date, of course, does matter, and Department of Planning mentioned some of these concerns. You know, currently with a 45-day before the end of the fiscal year period, you know, that gives us enough time to incorporate essentially everything that's happened at the end of the General Assembly session. We agree that April 15th is too early and would cut that short. So we would agree with the amendment to push that back to April 30th. That still is cutting it a little bit short, frankly, given the timelines of the end of the session and how quickly that material would be turned around. But we understand the council desires to have a little bit more time to work with the budget, and I think that's a good balance between the current deadline of 45 days before the end of the fiscal year, which is about May 10th, and what was proposed by the committee, which is April 15th. I did want to note, too, on that section, we would like to propose two small cleanup amendments that we'll work with DLR on. You know, one is there's still language in there that references the preliminary budget, and we just want to be clear, if we move to this one deadline, we wouldn't want to do any release of any information before that. We would just want to complete the budget and turn it over to the council. And so there is some language that was still remaining that we can point to that still references the preliminary budget, which, just to avoid any confusion, we would want to get out of there. And then there's also in that section language about advertising the final ordinance in 2 newspapers of record in Baltimore City. And what I can tell you about that is that the newspaper ads basically just list agency, service, and amount with no additional materials, and they get published in the Baltimore Sun and the Afro-American, and we pay tens of thousands of dollars to put those ads into those newspapers. I don't think they add any value to the process. Our budget publications, of course, have much more information, so we think those provisions are just out of date and could be eliminated. So to summarize on that one, agree with a one deadline, final deadline, would amend to have that deadline be April 30th. So support that concept with that amendment and those cleanup amendments. The second item around the—
Bob, just real quick, is the advertising component specifically noted in your bill report
It is.
as an amendment request?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then the second category is around the property tax rate ordinance. So the current charter requires the ordinance of estimates to be passed before the property tax rate ordinance can be passed and then certified. And
This is not actually in this bill. We had a lot of discussion about this, and we got to a point where we were like finalizing what we wanted to have drafted and introduced. And we had a lot of back and forth about this. And because we didn't have anybody actually saying, we want this, we want this, we want this, we kind of decided to back off on it. So this would have to be put in as an amendment. It is not in the
Okay.
bill right now.
do you want us to give our point of view on it, or?
Please.
So on the property tax ordinance, today what happens is ordinance has to be passed and then the tax rate is passed. And we think the reason for that is that if the council were to make changes to the ordinance, it would offer the possibility to change the tax rate down. So in other words, if the council chose to just cut money out of the ordinance and not reappropriate it, that gives them the ability to choose a lower tax rate than what was proposed. However, it causes a lot of problems having it in that sequential order. So our State Department of Assessments typically asks the city to certify, actually asks all counties to certify its final tax rate by sometime in early June. And so what's happened for years is because that final tax rate ordinance is not passed until very late in June, we've had to go through this whole thing where we're like, okay, we're certifying a preliminary tax rate. It's not formally been adopted by the council, but it likely will be adopted by the council at the rate we've proposed. And as long as I've been here, working on the budget for almost 20 years now, the rate that's been proposed has always ended up being the rate that is adopted. If these were decoupled, if they didn't have to go in sequential order of ordinance and then property tax rate, we could submit a property tax rate to the council early on in the process, the one that we're proposing in the budget. The council could adopt it. We could certify that rate, send it to SDAT so that we could begin the preparation of our tax bills. The council could always come back at the end of the process and recall that bill and change the tax rate if they wish. But it would solve a lot of our problems working with SDAT, and there's been a lot of time spent by MOGR and finance trying to dance around this question with SDAT of, hey, we need to get you a certified tax rate, but the tax rate in our charter doesn't allow that to happen until later in June.
Yeah, you used the phrase certify a preliminary tax rate, but that's not a real thing, right? Like, that's nonsensical, right?
Yeah,
Like,
so
you want to certify the actual tax rate. You can't
Exactly.
certify a preliminary tax rate.
That's exactly right. And so, so that amendment, I understand there was a lot of discussion on it. That would save us, I think, a lot of time and energy that we've spent over the last few years with MOGR. And in that process, we've learned that most other county budgets are wrapped up before that. Ours is one of the few that goes kind of that late into the fiscal year. And so that provision would help us, and we will consider putting an amendment in for that purpose.
I want to finish up with our bill reports real quick, and then we're going to come back to all these issues that have been raised. Thank you, Bob. Are you finished?
Not yet.
Okay,
Still
good.
those other provisions. So the third provision was the contingent fund. The current charter is almost quaint, and that allows us to have up to $1 million for emergencies. The reality is that we've built up a pretty large rainy day fund over the years, which is common practice among many county governments to handle emergencies. When we've had emergencies, they're usually in the tens of millions of dollars, unanticipated type emergencies. So there's no need to have a contingent fund for that purpose. However, the language around the contingent fund giving us a little bit more flexibility, we do support that that proposal and removing the limit of 1 million. I can tell you that it does help us during our closeout of the fiscal year. You know, in today's world, all changes in any difference in appropriation where an agency spends over their adopted appropriation has to go to the council, and we do encounter situations where there is small amounts of money over the appropriation that probably is not worth us taking something all the way to the council if it's $10,000 or $50,000. I can think of some examples in my career. There were technical things that got posted to a wrong fiscal year, where today we've got to come with a package of those to you and get those approved. We're having that contingent fund. We can just go to the board and say, look, this was something very small that was over the appropriation, and get that handled and not waste everybody's time coming to the council for a pretty minor type issue. So we would support keeping the contingent fund and giving some flexibility to use that. The final three pieces we do have concerns with and are opposed to. So the first one is the conditions on appropriations, and I would agree and echo the thoughts of the prior speakers. You know, that could create administrative uncertainty for agencies. It could delay city services if, you know, an appropriation wasn't released while they were waiting to satisfy some condition. You know, the council does have existing mechanisms today to express their intent. You know, they can move money in the ordinance, they can pass legislation. You know, there's a lot of follow-up material that comes, of course, out of the budget hearings. So we think having those conditions on there is a step too far and could slow down city service delivery. On the non-lapsing funds, you know, we're opposed to that provision. Our concern is that, you know, there should be a very high threshold for someone to set up a separate non-lapsing fund. The danger here that we see is that when you have off-budget funds, it tends to erode the value of the budget process. In a good budget process, you figure out how many resources you have, you evaluate all the different priorities, you allocate them, you set the budget, you move on to execution. When you have those you know, situations where you're fencing off money, it just limits the ability for us to react to evolving needs. I would also say there's additional risk here that was referred to in one of the prior, I think, law department's report around the council already has the right to assign revenue to a non-lapsing fund. And, you know, that's also a danger here. We're a high tax jurisdiction, and, you know, you already have a process where revenues are accounted for in your budget process. And so, you know, you could have situations where you're adding a revenue source for a particular, you know, for a particular program, particular non-lapsing fund, whereas our goal in our 10-year financial plan is to keep our tax rates as low as humanly possible. And then the final one is the veto provision, and we would just agree with the prior comments around, the mayor does need some time, even in the budget process. We think the timelines that were proposed were a little bit too tight. The mayor does need some time to evaluate, things that come back from the council, even in that condensed timeline around the budget process. And so we would oppose that item as well. I wanted to mention one other thing that didn't come out of the committee's work, but that was talked about informally around supplemental appropriations around grants. So I think, Mr. Chair, we had discussed this informally, and, the current charter requires us to come to the council with any additional spending beyond what's appropriated. And in practice, what that means is that if we get a new grant during the middle of a fiscal year, we have to go all the way to the council to get that approved. That, in my experience, a lot of that is non-value added work because a grant already comes with conditions attached. In my career, I went back and looked, the council has never rejected a grant supplemental. When we get money from a private funding source or state source or federal source, we're almost always going to want to use that money unless there's some other condition on it. So, we had looked at the language and we think there could be a simple amendment to improve our process that we'd only go to the council for full grant supplementals if it exceeded a certain amount of money, whether that's 3 million or 5 million or 1 million. We could debate that, but in my history, I went back and looked, the council has never rejected a grant supplemental for pretty obvious reasons, because we're getting new money and we want to spend it. And there's a lot of behind the scenes effort that goes into that. We have to write a bill report. We have to brief committee members. And again, in my experience, when I come here, I've often had council members kind of look at me like, why are we coming for a $20,000 or $50,000 grant? So again, if you put a limit on that and said, we'll come to you for the big stuff, but the smaller stuff can just be approved by the board or administratively, that would clean up, I think, a lot of additional, non-value added work. So that summarizes our comments on the budget stuff, and I'll pause and take any questions now or later when you.
We'll finish up with procurement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, honorable council members. Adam Manny, your Chief Procurement Officer. I'm here today in support of the amendment, thank you, sir, of 26-0172, the charter amendment to remove the prescribed procurement requirements from the city charter and put them into a more flexible ordinance-driven framework. This would align the city with other large public entities, counties, cities, states, and the federal government, where the procurement regulations are in ordinance and code, not in the charter. This change also helps in aligning us with the current procurement practices and allows us to become more proactive instead of reactive to changing market conditions, economic realities, and administrative changes. It also falls into line with the mayor's procurement transformation, which has been out as we're moving towards, and all in all will give us a lot more flexibility to again be proactive and move forward instead of going through the constrictive charter change that we have to do now. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. And DOT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Luciano Diaz for the Department of Transportation. So, thank you guys for your work on all of this. We're particularly excited about provisions on procurement, but to get the bad out of the way first, the department does echo concerns about changes being made to conditions placed on appropriations. We are concerned that by restricting funding and attaching essentially prerequisites to the release of funds, the city may miss out on funding streams that have to be dedicated towards certain projects. So for example, highway user revenue being the backbone of DOT's funding structure. If that money is restricted, it is not necessarily going to be recoverable by the city the following year. So we just want to make sure that we can continue to access our funding and delivering work predictably and not run into challenges there. In terms of favorable aspects of these amendments, again, we are excited about proposals to remove low bid procurement requirements. Something the agency has consistently run into issues with is the selection of low bidders in contracts, because while it results in short-term savings, it doesn't necessarily deliver the best value to the city and taxpayers. Many times we run into a large number of change orders. The cost of doing certain work is underestimated, leading to adjustments later down the line. And overall, we end up with a lower quality product. By removing low bid requirements from the procurement process, we're able to better evaluate a bid on its overall quality, the expertise of the contractor, their familiarity with the project. We can, determine what is more likely to give DOT a high quality project. In terms of franchise agreements, franchises being a legal agreement between the city and an utility for the use of city right-of-way and the provision of its services. We are generally in favor of the provisions of this amendment. I just wanted to note that one of the changes being made in this section is that the city would essentially repeal what is currently a on-paper monopoly over conduit within city limits. This was done in part to make the charter more congruent with our reality. For example, BG and the city have been in a sort of franchise agreement for longer than the conduit system has existed. So preventing the city from granting franchises for conduit does not make sense, and it's not productive. And in terms of minor privilege, which is a type of franchise agreement, just wanted to note that we concur with previous comments by other agencies. Moving this out of the Board of Estimates would free up a lot of overhead work that the board and staff currently do. Minor privileges are generally not very impactful to the right-of-way. In many cases, these are stairs or canopies over hanging doors, just minor protrusions into public right-of-way. We would want to work with the council on the proposed legislative process DOT would follow for the approval and review of these. But other than that, we do not have concerns with this change to the charter. And those are our comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll note that while the minor privilege component of this is particularly of interest to DOT as the controlling agency over use of the public right-of-way generally, that and I think that the committee here takes the comments pertaining to low bid as perspective that is shared by all of our operational agencies, that the low bid award requirement is as much a hindrance to best outcomes and best value for taxpayers for DOT as it is for DPW and for Rec and Parks and for others. So we take that as a sort of, I would say, universal comment. Okay. So, committee members, we have heard a bunch of comments on various provisions of the bill. I think perhaps maybe we want to kind of go one kind of topic at a time and try to get questions on them. So let's, I think I'll start with the vice chair and okay, I'll start to my left with Councilman Blanchard, and he can pick whatever topic he wants to get into, and then we maybe we'll stick on that topic for a little bit and just have some conversation about that. And I know Ethan has some slides that we may pull up along the way, and I know he's got kind of in the queue, and I can ask him to pull it up if I think it's going to be helpful or relevant to the discussion. So why don't you just. And I just went to my left just because I was looking in that direction. Actually, can we go ladies first?
Sure thing, Mr. Chair.
We're going to go to Councilwoman Ramos. We're going to go to Councilwoman Ramos.
Mr. Chair, is there a topic you want to start on?
No, I want you to pick one.
Great, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question, I think it's for the mayor's office or really anybody that talked about this. On the April 30th versus April 15th timing, I wanted to just remind folks that other jurisdictions get their budgets out to their colleagues, my colleagues, in other jurisdictions really early. As a matter of fact, several of them actually approve their budgets prior to the General Assembly actually finishing their work. So could you talk about why we're different, that we need to wait for the General Assembly to end when we could get the budget, and then if we had to amend it because of the General Assembly, that we could? And I'll just preface this by saying that I would like to have more time on the budget for two reasons. One is I actually, and I think all of us do, like to interact with our constituents and ask them what they think about the budget. And often we just don't have that kind of time with just the 40 days or 30 days. And secondly, I think, we could be a lot more thoughtful in our questions and in all of the other things that we do around the budget if we had more time, so.
So I would respond to that, Councilman, by saying, and Sarah had alluded to this, our process, and I don't know how the other counties are on this front, is once we submit the ordinance, we cannot make changes to it after it comes to the council. So, my thought process here is with that state's, General Assembly session ending, it is important to try to get as much in as you can, because if you don't, then you have to come with a bunch of individual supplementary appropriation bills, which individually take a lot of time, right? So on the operating side, I can say that, at this point, we mostly know what's happening in the session. I mean, the session just ended. We have a good idea. It usually does take about a week or two for our MRGR team and our folks down at Annapolis to kind of digest everything, especially the scramble of those last couple of days. I would defer to Sarah. I think there's a lot more earmarked money for capital projects on the capital side. I mean, I would defer to her on that. That probably requires.
Can I get you to, I want everybody to stay as close to the microphone because we do have people online. This is being recorded. I want everybody to be heard very clearly for posterity.
Yeah, so on the operating side of the budget, that, like I said, that April 30th deadline is still a little bit tight. Right now we're about middle of April. The session just ended. I can tell you we have a meeting like next week to go over with our MRGR folks and folks in Annapolis to figure out, with that last couple of days, what were the final results of some of the bills that could affect our operating budget. We mostly know the big stuff. I think on the capital side, sometimes there's earmarks and things like that that are put in for particular projects. And so the idea would be you want to be able to get as much into the ordinance as you can so that we don't waste the time of having to do individual supplemental appropriation bills, after the budget is adopted. But I'll defer to the others if you have other points on that.
So one of the amendments that we proposed is along similar lines to what you were suggesting, Councilwoman, that would allow the Planning Commission to provide updates directly to the council after the ordinance of estimates is introduced, so that we can have the Planning Commission review and make recommendations to the council on what was in the state budget. We also get other kind of late-breaking information, so the state budget is kind of the most prominent, but there have been times after Planning Commission has made its initial recommendations that we've gotten other new information besides the state budget that we want to make sure that Planning Commission has an opportunity to review and provide recommendations to the council. So that was part of the thinking behind the amendment that we proposed.
I appreciate that. I think what the analysis that we've done really just dug into the dates, and I would need to talk to some of my colleagues to understand if they can make changes along the way, which I think they can, other colleagues in other jurisdictions, because I do think that it's important that we have more time. And I still don't really understand why we have. But I understand that also the issue of if we needed to put some language in here similar to what you had suggested, which is that you could, through the amendment process, put something in, then maybe that's what we need to do. But I think that it's important that we have more time on this. So I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, that was my only question on this particular topic.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I just?
Ben, yes.
With respect to the suggestion by the by planning, requesting the ability to amend the ordinance of estimates after introduction with the value add of having sine die having occurred and knowing final state numbers. We would also need to consider to what degree, what value you can increase the overall budget figure, because presently in that section of the charter, the council is restricted from increasing the overall size of the budget. So that would need to be discussed as well in this.
Thank you. I know when we talked about the issue of supplemental appropriations, we had discussion in the committee about the concept of saying that where it generally makes sense that the council can't just like say, we're increasing the overall budget because it's revenue that we don't have a source for, especially when we're talking about things that would rely on state or federal funds. We don't just magically say, we wrote it in the budget, so now we have the money. But saying something like that if requested by the Planning Commission or by the Finance Department, that increases could be made to the overall budget, even including for state, federal, or grant appropriations, if requested by them, because it would be something that, like, if the city council receives a formal request, we would likely then be considering there's validity to this request. We trust that this request is made in good faith and with the good backing of the understanding that we're actually going to get this money, and that that's a reasonable way for the council to be able to increase the funds. So this is something that we discussed. Frankly, it was one of this and the thing about the decoupling of the revenue ordinance and the budget ordinance were two things that I had discussions with the former budget director about, and the timing of it was such that as I continued to try to follow up to have help continuing to discuss that, we didn't, it didn't work out. And so we don't have those things in this bill right now, but we're aware of it and have kind of discussed it conceptually. To the Vice Chair?
Different topic?
Can we stick on the budget timing for another minute?
Budget timing, so I got a different topic.
Okay.
I
Councilman
have
Jones?
no questions regarding this topic, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Blanchard? Because if I take it, it's also, I'm going to take us into the discussion of the veto override timing and things like that
Yeah.
also. I'm going to put these two things together.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the budget timing conversation, I know that I had a conversation with my colleagues in Montgomery County who said that they are looking at moving their budget timing back some. Right now, theirs is in the middle of March, so there is obviously a sweet spot here. I guess I am struggling to see what the 2 extra weeks get us. Have we, I guess it would be helpful to talk to our counterparts in Baltimore County and see if there's, or something to that effect, if there's is there a big demand there that this needs to be done later than it is now? I mean, it seems like a good case study. Does anyone have any feedback on that?
I mean, I would just say that it sometimes, I think, comes to a surprise to people when we say we start our planning process like all the way back in August of the previous year. And just to walk through quickly the timeline, you've got to develop what we call our current level of service, where you say, what happens if there's just inflation and there's no change of law? What does everything become? We have about a 6-week period where we open up for agency proposals, where we have to give our agencies time to, digest the guidance they're getting from us, put a proposal in, move line items, propose enhancements, make cuts, whatever the guidance has been. Then there's a timeline, of our staff to go through all those proposals, present all that information to the mayor and his senior team to queue all those things up for decision, and then the timeline to put the budget books together. If we were to have an earlier deadline, that's why I stressed really getting rid of that preliminary budget is really important to us, because if, when, like that just, there's a lot of wasted time in there because you're producing a book that could just be the final book. But today we produce it, and we have to come back and produce almost the same thing with a lot of the same material. So that's why we thought that April 30th was a reasonable compromise, because we are saving a little bit of time if we eliminate that preliminary budget step, which takes a lot of time, so that we could start our process a little bit later. But I do think the General Assembly is important from the perspective of trying to capture everything that are coming from state grants to give us that time frame. And I can tell you just generally, like talking by month, usually all the agency proposal, the CLS and the agency proposal material all happens before the holidays. And then when we come back from the holidays, it's, week after week for our staff to kind of review all the proposals, develop, options for the mayor and team to go through every single agency. We're talking, billions of dollars here to make those decisions. And then you need about 3 to 4 weeks to actually prepare the publication that we're required to submit to the council, because you've got to check all the numbers, you've got to write all the material. So, by the time you get to March and into April, you basically run out of time. So if you push it up too soon, we would be starting our process potentially in July, when we haven't even closed out the prior fiscal year. And that's when you get into kind of a danger zone, I think, for our staff, of where like we usually use July and August to close out the prior fiscal year. And then at the end of August, early September, we turn our attention to, planning truly for the next year's budget. If you're crossing those and all of a sudden you're starting planning of the next year's budget back in July or August, then I think we're putting ourselves at risk of doing poorly on both of those exercises, where you want to close out the fiscal year, get that done, and then move on to the planning for the next fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. And I apologize if there's a lot going on here. Like in this hearing, the current charter amendment does not impact, there still would need to be a mayor's preliminary budget.
Let me speak to this for 1 second, because I made a request of DLR. So we had a discussion in our last or second to last hearing on deliberating on these proposals for drafting, about just taking the Board of Estimates out of this process and eliminating this whole, I meant to interject this earlier, but just getting the Board of Estimates and this whole preliminary budget process taken out, and just doing what is normal in basically every other place, where the executive prepares a budget and submits it for consideration to the legislative branch. And we've asked DLR, and DLR is already working on a rather multifaceted amendment that is required in order to get at like the various parts of the charter that touch on aspects of this, even briefly here and there. So that's already in the works, and I will bring that as an amendment when we get to it.
Okay, and the mayor's office also thinks that aspect of, I knew about the skipping the Board of Estimates part. I guess I didn't understand the preliminary part, but.
Yes, we obviously need to see the language first, but we generally support it, and we've already communicated that to the chair.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sarah?
So since I wasn't in the bill, we didn't respond to that.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
Oh, since I wasn't in the bill, we didn't respond to that proposal, but we would love to have a chance to respond, because I think there may be some other impacts if the budget isn't going to Board of Estimates. We take capital transfers to Board of Estimates, for example, and I think the logic behind that is because BOE has approved the budget and these are changes to the budget. So we would just want to, I think, look at some of the other impacts if Board of Estimates isn't reviewing the budget, if there's an opportunity to do that once that
The idea is,
amendment
though,
is drafted.
that the Planning Commission would be making its recommendations directly to the mayor, and the mayor would be including them in the budget to propose to the council. So, yeah. Let me ask a process question. I think I asked this a month or so ago, but don't think I got an answer about this. The capital budget is made up, in many cases, of federal or state money that is paired with a local contribution, often in the form of a local match that, we give $1 million, we get $3 million or $4 million or whatever. But there is some amount of general fund revenue that does go into the capital budget. Who makes the decision at what point, how much general fund revenue is going to the capital budget versus the operating budget?
Sure, so I can answer that. We generally will do that in the fall. Again, based on that current level of service exercise to see if our revenues can support the same services that we provided the year before, to see if there's a gap. Based on that information, we will go to the Planning Commission and advise them and say, we have X million this year for PAYGO capital out of the general fund. I can tell you, there's been years where that number's been zero, when it's been an economic downturn or very low. Right now, it's been better, and the budget we presented this year has much more spending than usual in general fund PAYGO, just because we had accumulated some resources from COVID repayments, reimbursements, so we were able to give more and provide more into that bucket. But it depends, and it's usually in the fall that we'll go. I'm trying to remember when we go to the Planning Commission. What month is that first? I'm sorry, I'm looking at Sarah.
The Planning Commission votes in mid-March, and we'd get initial estimates of the PAYGO funds in the fall, but they are revised up until Planning Commission votes.
Right.
Okay. Ethan, can you pull up this screen here? I just want to put this here for everybody to be real clear that when we're talking about a potential earlier date and how we stack up against peer jurisdictions, we are definitely the latest among any of our, big 5 county peers here in Maryland. And in the case of Prince George's County and Montgomery County, by far, and in every one of these cases, this is not a preliminary budget delivery. This is when the county executive delivers an ordinance to their legislative body, and the legislative body has everything that they need in order to be able to consider the budget. Now, I know Councilman Blanchard did just mention having spoken to a council member from Montgomery County, and that they are considering moving it to a later date. And I understand from the things that are said here that there is a likely good practical reason for that. That March 15th is the earliest date of there. But even if we move to April 30th, we are still, equal to the absolute latest that exists among any of our peers. And moving to April 15th would really keep us in the middle of the mix. Although I guess if Prince George's and Montgomery County were to move theirs to April 15th, we would be the earliest with them, right? So I just want to put that there for everybody's due reference, that we are we are clearly the latest, and that these other jurisdictions have not seemed to fall apart in their ability to budget, and that all of these are just operating budgets, that in these other jurisdictions, in some cases, their capital budget comes as early as January 1st. So they have separate ordinances for their operating and capital budgets. And I think had I to do this over again, I probably would have pulled Finance and Planning Commission or planning staff in to give us a more in-depth thing, just because this is a concept of separating the operating and the capital budget that Councilman Ramos brought up. But it was discussed as a kind of a concept, as an idea. And we would like to get an understanding, I think, from Finance and from Planning about the concept of decoupling these two things so that they don't necessarily have to be in a single ordinance. Do you have any perspective to share off the top right now? We're getting into a little investigative kind of mode here, but.
To your earlier question, both the general funds PAYGO and highway user revenue can be used for both operating and capital. And so there is a relationship between the two that's important, and decisions that are made on one, affect the other. So I think I don't want to speak for Finance, but I think it'd be a challenge to separate them completely.
I would say the same. And remember, even though we set a target in the fall and say, Planning Commission, you can, for your preliminary planning, you can count on $15 million of general fund pay-go. There's been years when we've gotten to the end of the process and our revenue estimates are downgraded and we've had to go back and say, sorry, all those projects you planned are getting cut out of the budget. And that happens right up until the deadline. So even if you give a number for planning purposes, you still have to, there's things that change. It doesn't have to be the state budget either. I think about a year when we have, some kind of economic distress where we've had to change at the last minute. That's not typical, but there have been years when we've had to wipe out, pay-go capital at the very last minute and it never gets presented. So I think, again, the danger there is you present something and the situation changes. I mean, January 1st seems crazy to me, just off the cuff, because that's just way too early. I would say on those, I hear your point on the dates. I would also want to know, I think we should be asking, when does their process start and what are the steps they go through in the process? And also, how many supplemental appropriations come to their council that they have to, consider because the...
Far fewer is the answer that our staff gives.
Okay, I would love to see that information and see what comes to them, because that's the downside, is that if you go too early, there can be a lot of things that change. Again, that you have to come back and, back to the council, back to the board over.
Is that something we could ask finance department staff to look into?
Yeah.
Like how many supplemental bills other jurisdictions have compared to us?
And
Mr. Director?
yeah, I just wanted to add one thought off the cuff. Michael Moxton, Finance Director. The jurisdictions across the country that were similar to other large cities, particularly the ones that I come from, New York City, by and large all have their city budgets come out after the state budget. And that is for a reason. The state budget has a huge effect in some years on the city budget. It depends on the year. Sometimes you're just talking about recognizing a couple of grants, but let's say we are talking about HUR a year from now. That's going to be a very complex discussion. That obviously has a massive impact on what we end up putting out in the city budget. And so these 2 weeks, this was really our thinking. The difference between April 15th and April 30th is the difference between a city budget that is taking in the state budget and one that isn't. And while you may have some years where that's not a huge distinction, I would foresee years where that becomes a very, very big distinction, where a budget that was finished before the state budget was finished becomes essentially meaningless if something really large dropped. So we can do additional research on those other big cities that I mentioned and their reasons for it, but those would be my off-the-cuff thoughts on the difference between April 15th and April 30th.
Great. I think that we'll do our own homework on this, but would also like for the finance department to give us some sort of report on what it thinks is important for us to consider, how we should be looking at this. Obviously, you're the experts in your field, and we might look down a path, thinking we're on the right path, and maybe not have something else that we should be considering. I want to pull up a diagram here. This is how I think that this budget timing relates also to these issues related to the veto timing. So, look, it has been said to us, look, if you want to exercise the ability to override a veto, just arrange the council schedule appropriately in order to do that. And this is what it would have to look like. If the council has to, under the current conditions, anticipate the potential of receiving a veto of the line item budget veto, and then having the ability to override it, this is what our schedule would have to look at. And this is based on this year's schedule. So Monday, June 29th, this is 2 days before the fiscal year changes over. And we have to wait at least 5 days between receiving a veto and when we're even permitted presently to be able to take up an override. So we have to go back a week and say that's when we would count on receiving the mayor's veto. And we have to also account then for the likelihood that the mayor runs out the clock and exercises ability to wait 3 regular city council meetings before having to give us final action. So Monday, June 22nd would be the 3rd council meeting after we pass the bill. And before that would be his 2nd, and before that would be his 1st meeting after the council passes it. And that means that the council would have to pass the budget on 3rd reader on June 1st. And just assuming common practice of a bill being passed on 2nd reader on one meeting and then on 3rd reader the meeting after that, we have to go back to Monday, May 25th, being the date that we would have to pass the bill on 2nd reader. And because we're required to get the budget at least 45 days before the end of the fiscal year, and assume that we're going to get the budget at a regularly scheduled council meeting, that's going to be Monday, May 11th. And so we get a whole 2 weeks from the time the budget is introduced to when we have to pass it, if we have to anticipate the ability that of what the charter clearly anticipates also. If you look at the bottom of this slide, the mayor may approve the provisions thereof relating to one or more items of appropriation and disapprove the others, and in such case, those the mayor shall approve shall become effective, and those which the mayor shall not approve shall be reconsidered by the city council. And so the charter very clearly anticipates both the use of the line item veto and the council exercising an ability to override that. But we have no practical ability to do that if we don't make changes specifically to the powers and the timing of the veto. And the budget, as a bill that is unique in that it has unique provisions. It's the only time in the ordinance of estimates when the mayor can exercise a line item veto power. It's reasonable that it should have other unique provisions to counterbalance that in the legislative branch, which is why when we are going to be passing the budget like we do, I think last year we passed the budget actually not right at the last minute of 5 days before the new fiscal year. I think we had a whopping 7 days between when we passed it and the new fiscal year. Generally, it's sometime, I think, between 10 and 7 days before the new fiscal year when the city council actually passes it. But under no circumstance would we have the opportunity then to override a veto if our amendments to the budget were vetoed by the mayor. And so we are being given this superficial sense that this is something that the charter anticipates us being able to do, but in reality have no practical path unless we accept the idea that we get the budget and we pass the budget only 2 weeks later. And even if we move it forward, we get the budget and it's passed 4 weeks later. On any other bill, one that isn't hundreds of pages long, we generally have 30 days just before we can even call a hearing and get agency reports on that. And so it's just totally impossible, a practical impossibility for us to exercise the power of the checks and balances of the veto and the veto override under the current circumstances. And that's why I think it's really important. And I would just love to hear somebody tell me here that we should not anticipate this, or that we should not have more than 2 weeks or 4 weeks to consider the budget in order to protect our right to override a veto if we have to anticipate one. Bob?
Can I just give my perspective? So I think one thing is the line item veto, the way I understood this is that the mayor, the point of the line item veto is so that he can veto just the one item that he has an objection to. So the rest of the, so you're not holding up the entire budget here, just to be clear. You would be just holding up one line item.
But as Jeff mentioned before, it is the interpretation of the law department, has always been the interpretation of the law department, and actually the suggestion of the law department that we actually put this into the charter so it's not hinging on interpretation, but that it is clear that once July 1st comes, the new fiscal year begins, the budget process is done. And so if we pass the budget a week before that and the mayor waits 3 council meetings or even 1 council meeting to give us the veto because the budget, because the new fiscal year has already begun, we cannot take a vote to override his line item veto power, which the charter in this, right here in this provision, very clearly anticipates us doing.
Okay, but in the current language, maybe I'm just not understanding, but in the current language.
This is the current language.
Okay.
It says right there, shall be reconsidered by the council. The charter very clearly anticipates us taking up an override to the mayor's line item veto power. This is the existing charter provision that grants the line item veto power and anticipates us overriding, which is practically impossible unless we use this timeline for when we pass the budget.
Okay, I would just say one thing, in my experience, we've never had a mayoral veto that I've experienced. There's a lot of negotiations back and forth, but in practice, this hasn't, just to be clear, this isn't a common scenario.
Sure.
And then I guess I'll have to check with law because my interpretation was always, there's a rule around the council must act on the ordinance by 5 days before the end of the fiscal year. But I was always interpreting it as if there are those items of disagreement where the mayor says, I'm approving all of the budget, but I'm vetoing this one thing. And that's never happened as long as I've been here, which is a long time, but it could. If that were to happen, I always interpret it as that dispute could last after June 30th and go into the next fiscal year. If that's not law's interpretation, we can.
That has never been the law department's interpretation.
Okay.
Jeff?
I can share law's memo on this topic with you. The question has been asked over and over again, but I believe you're right that it's never actually come up
because
there is sort of cooperation and agreement to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I'll say for as appreciative as I am of the cooperative, collaborative negotiating process, just if I step back and take a 10,000-foot view of this, if one side knows that no matter what it negotiates or changes, that the other side can negate that with impunity, then the one side really is in a disempowered position from the very outset and is not going to work in the same way as it would necessarily if it didn't know that it was already cut off at the knees.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I may,
please.
Has this administration acted in a way that you believe that we don't act in good faith?
No, and I think that we've been clear. I think I was just clear that I'm very appreciative of the process and the tenor of things generally, but it's a matter of principle, and it's a matter of even in the administration's response on certain topics here, it was stated, this isn't about the current people, right? This is about the potential for future bad actors, right? And so I can't guarantee that in the future there will always be wonderful cooperation, but I can guarantee that unless we adhere to a completely preposterous timeline, that the city council absolutely cannot exercise the ability to override the line item veto power, which is a unique provision given to the executive, while there is no comparable unique provision given to the legislative branch. Now, we could just as well do away with the ability to exercise a line item veto power or any veto on the budget, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying, what's the way that you balance out the nature of there being a unique circumstance given to the budget for one side of the negotiating table and no comparable unique provision that balances that out? And I think that we have a reasonable proposal here to create a unique provision for how soon a veto needs to be given unique to the budget. Given that we have a mandate to pass the budget 5 days and that the mayor is one person And generally, I don't know how many millions of dollars were amended in last year's budget. It wasn't that many, especially relative to the billions of dollars in the overall budget. And so the budget ends up being 99+% the way it was proposed to us in the first place. And so a relatively small change like that seems like something that should be reasonable for one person and a team of advisors to be able to consider on a 2-day turnaround that allows a body of 15 people just then 3 days potentially to herd all the cats and get everybody into the room to take an actual vote of a 15-member body as to whether it wants to override it. I mean, it's just there's no other way around, there's no other way to ensure that we have this power that the charter clearly anticipates. That's my sense on this. And that still wouldn't be possible if we didn't also clarify when the council is able to take up an override. We have a totally convoluted system right now, and I know that we heard some opposition to provisions generally relating to the veto, and I guess I'd like to ask for clarification. Does the mayor's office also oppose the council having a simpler, clearer expression of when it can take up a veto override? Right now, the charter says we're not allowed to take up an override in fewer than 5 days after the veto's been given to us, or more than 20 days after the veto is being given to us, unless there is no regularly scheduled council meeting in that 5 to 20 day span, in which case we can take up the override at the first council meeting after the 20th day. And we're proposing to just say, isn't it our business whether or not we take up a veto override? Isn't it our business if we want to make that decision in 1 day or 2 days or 10 days? And isn't it our business if that happens at a special meeting that we call specifically for that purpose, rather than being beholden to a meeting that was scheduled at the beginning of the year or before the beginning of the year as a regular council meeting? Is there opposition to us clarifying this as we propose to just say that we can take up an override at any time within 21 days?
At this time, we do not support the charter amendment around any changes to the mayor's veto authority.
Okay, and the last thing I'll bring up here is, Ethan, do you have the slide about other jurisdictions' veto timing? Yeah, this slide here highlights Baltimore County, Howard County, and Prince George's County. There may be others. We confirmed these for sure. All of these counties, their executive has 10 days to give a veto. When their legislature passes a bill, they don't measure it in number of council meetings or number of regular council meetings. The executive has 10 days to render a veto if they so choose. And so the proposal that we have to go from 3 regular council meetings to 2 council meetings at the very least, and under the most strict of circumstances, would still afford a minimum of 2 weeks. In most cases, it's going to end up still affording 4 weeks, maybe 3 weeks occasionally, if there happens to be a council meeting 2 weeks after the date that we pass a bill, and then another council meeting the week after that, or something to that effect. 2 meetings in the span of 3 weeks would get you 3 weeks, but generally it would be 4 weeks, which is still
Yeah, and Mr.
a lot
Chair,
more than 10.
yeah, I think that's an oversimplification of what this actually does, right? So it's not, the issue is not just a number of weeks, it's how that time is structured and the flexibility it provides to conduct a review of the legislation. The current charter ties the timeline to 3 regular council meetings, which is a predictable and workable window for legal review, because as you know, when you send a bill, well, when Ethan sends a bill to me, right, delivering it to the mayor's office, we send that bill to the law department, actually, and the mayor doesn't see it yet. That bill goes back to the law department for review for form of legal sufficiency. And then it comes back to MOGR with any flags or any potential issues with that bill. We then put that to the mayor to be able to make the decision. Moving to 2 meetings, especially when the meeting schedule can vary, compresses that window in a way that is not tied to the actual complexity of different pieces of legislation that has even come to this body so far this term. Some bills are straightforward, other ones require significant analysis, coordination, and as we've seen, sometimes correction. It is also at that period where, depending on the bill, we receive a lot of feedback from the residents of this city. I can't tell you how many emails I get when a bill goes to the mayor's desk with just, letters of concern or even letters of support from residents of the city or other external parties that we take into consideration when we make a recommendation to the mayor on whether to sign, veto, or let a bill go into effect without his signature. We've had instances this term where we've had to send bills back to this council for correction. So we do not need to be shortening the time that the executive has to sit with a piece of legislation, review it with their team, review it with the law department, and taking into consideration any feedback from the residents of our city around what action the executive should take on an ordinance or resolution passed by the city council.
Thank you. I'll just note, and then I'm going to move on from this topic. I'll note that in each of the cases that we have had bills sent back to the council, it did not take 2 or 6 weeks to get that back to us. That assessment was done very promptly, and that I believe, look,
that's not true in every case. There was one bill.
I'm speaking, okay?
Okay.
The City of Baltimore is not incompetent. We're not less competent than our peer jurisdictions. And I think that the same level, I think that the same level of review likely goes into due diligence in our peer jurisdictions. And so I tend to think that if 10 days is enough for our peer jurisdictions, that 2 or 3 or 4 weeks is probably sufficient. I wonder just how it could be that we must have essentially 6 weeks when our peer jurisdictions need significantly less time than that to do what I would say is similar or equal due diligence. I'm going to go to the vice chair now.
Topic. All right. So one thing that's come up before has been, and I'm going to talk about the process a bit about the council authority to set conditions on appropriations. One thing that I don't think we've really talked about as well as what that looks like. I understand the opposition as well. What's interesting, I think about the language being used, and I'm speaking professorial, so just don't be mad at me. But again, in terms of the language used, thus far today and in the past, it's been, we've never seen a current mayor do X, Y, and Z. We've never had this circumstance, but we're also in this process preparing for what possibilities could be. And I know that there is also, even some of our previous discussions, right? This council may not restrict funds in a deleterious fashion, but another council may do that. Again, I think, it's worth talking about keeping the best of intentions from all different parties. But I am curious in terms of what this could look like in terms of setting conditions on appropriations, because it seems, one, what that process would actually look like, right? Is this the budget committee or is this the council making a vote to say, hey, I won't name it, pick a department. Department X, Y, and Z, they're responsible for creating 800 widgets a year. we are not pleased with the number of widgets that are being produced. So we, as a budget committee, are going to make a recommendation to the council to say we're going to withhold this portion of the widget budget until we have sufficient confidence that these things are being produced. I'm still curious about the opposition to that, because I understand there's talk about, timing of funds and all that, but is the thought that the council would just willy-nilly or just in a non-thoughtful way desire to restrict funds? I just want to talk about, one, what that process looks like in terms of restricting funds, but also just thinking about this operationally too.
Sure. I mean, accountability is critical, and the council already has strong tools to exercise it through the budget process, oversight hearings. This council has been very active in its oversight, reporting requirements, and confirmation authority, right? But this proposal goes beyond oversight, right? It's an infringement upon the executive authority. I think the charter, rightfully so, acknowledges the separation of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The legislative branch passes ordinances and resolution, which includes the budget, and the executive branch executes that. The legislative branch will be passing an ordinance and then subsequently telling the executive what to do, you can't take action until this happens. That's a direct infringement upon the executive's authority to execute the ordinance that was passed by the council, right? And so once the funds are appropriated in the ordinance of estimates, agencies need to be able to deploy those resources in a timely and predictable way. And once you add these conditions on, you start to that would start to complicate and kind of muddy the waters on how we are, how agencies are expending those funds.
That's helpful. Let's keep walking down this pathway. Okay, so as a council passes the budget, right, we have a budget proposal, and the proposal is for the agency to spend these monies in these ways. And obviously, the executive branch executes or has power over the agencies to execute, right? But the council's passing these budgets and these amounts for specific purposes. And then if those purposes are not being met, there's no recompense, there's no recall, there's no latitude that the council has after passing that budget. So again, we say we want agency A to do, we're appropriating this amount of money because we expect them to do X, Y, and Z. They don't do X, Y, and Z. The only person that can make them do X, Y, and Z is the executive, but if the executive doesn't make them do X, Y, and Z, then what's the council's role at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I disagree to an extent because, I mean, if I even just take the Land Use and Transportation Committee, for an example, Land Use and Transportation, there have been situations where the chair of that committee has made some, has flagged things that the agencies could be doing better, right? And over the course and through the course of oversight ability and capability has contributed to some operational changes in those agencies. So the council, you can use your oversight ability to hold that agency accountable if you feel like they aren't using the funds that have been appropriated to them by this council in a manner that you all agreed to when you passed the budget. That's one way. The other way is you can come back that next fiscal year because you have the ability to cut money, and then you can cut, and then it will be on the executive and the legislative branch to kind of have that dance, and then, if the council's will be done and then it gets cut, it gets cut. Or if the executive prevails and is able to get enough council members to agree that the cut isn't necessary, then it doesn't, right? That's the balance of government. I think that if you just straightforwardly say, in this circumstance that we can put a condition on an appropriation, it opens up just an entire can of worms around who is the arbiter on whether or not that condition is met. And we've seen it with, committee requests where we feel like we've responded to the request and we've met it, only to come back to that council member or that respective chair to be told this isn't what I asked for. And then there are rounds and rounds of revisions That's fine when you're just talking about memos back and forth about an operational thing. It's a separate thing when you're talking about a back and forth, and what's hanging in the balance is a delivery of service to our residents. What's hanging in the balance is millions of dollars.
Got it. No, that's a helpful. And again, I appreciate the conversation because again, this is useful. I think, and I'm so glad you answered it in that way, because I think one of the things that I would be concerned about, and I think we have to be very diligent about this as a council, if we were to go down the road of restricting funds or making conditions, that it wouldn't be unilaterally, right? So it wouldn't be councilman of the 9th district determines that you're not meeting these goals, right? There would have to be some sort of standard that the council agrees upon to say, we expected the agency to do X, Y, and Z. It comes to a vote. It would have to be something clear as opposed to one individual, because I do get your point, and it would have to be something that's clear and transparent in terms of doing that.
And to that other point, Mr. Vice Chair, I think the point around who decides whether the condition is met is important, because the 8 members of the council could say, yes, we agree, this is right and this is honorable. But then when we come back and say, let's say the condition is the DOT needs to repave Broadway and Landvale for Councilman Jones, and we go out and repave it, but we don't pave it to his expectation, or we miss the ADA ramp, or, and then that condition isn't met, but we feel like, no, we repaved the road, that, let's say it's $3 million. That $3 million to the Department of Transportation hangs in the balance until, because I would assume that the council would want to be the arbiter of when the administration has met a condition that it set. That becomes very political and very quickly, where folks can start to use that, again, if you're saying we're not thinking about this current body, to start to tie the hands of the executive, or start to just find ways to get leverage to hold up projects.
I appreciate you answering the question. And again, I just appreciate having the dialogue here and us thinking through this stuff in the public sector. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to, I'm going to go to Councilman Jones in just a second. I want to pull up a couple of slides here real quick to give an example of what we're talking about here. Yeah. This is an example of a condition placed in the budget by the executive, Governor Wes Moore. The idea of setting conditions on whether or not funding is released based on actions being taken is in absolutely no way unique or considered a bad budgeting practice. It happens right there, and it's not just from the General Assembly. It is in the budget of the state of Maryland from the very start when the governor proposes it. And if you look through the budget of the state of Maryland again and again and again, you'll see, go back there one more second. You'll see this phrase, like provided that. If you just search for provided that in the state budget, and anywhere you see it's not underlined, that was put in there by the governor. So this is a common routine practice. And then when you go through and you see anywhere where you see provided that, and it's underlined, that is one of many of these such amendments that are put into the state budget every single year. And nobody is alleging that the state of the state's General Assembly shouldn't have this power because it could be used in some hypothetically reckless or deleterious manner. And the state of Maryland is not unique in this, that this is an entirely common budgetary practice. And it is considered essential. Now look, I'm not gonna go into it, but I would contest that we do not have strong powers to influence and oversee, that we have the bully pulpit and we have the bully pulpit. We can stomp on the floor, we can pound on the table, but there's this line from Kill Bill that I won't complete that starts with, the only thing that seems to work with you kids is, and if you've seen the movie, you know what the line is. The ability to say, look, we have an oversight not just authority, but responsibility, and the ability to say, look, a reasonable little thing is something that needs to be delivered to us in order for us to do our jobs better, both for the sake of directly delivering for constituents, as well as preparing us to conduct better oversight in the future. What is the amount here? It's $100,000 is the kind of routine thing that happens, and we're talking about $100,000 being constrained out of a budget. I don't know if this is the one. I know I looked at one. It was a $100,000 constrained out of an agency's budget that was $968 million. This is an inconsequential amount of money, and this is the way that it is used in an utterly reasonable way to say, we want this information. We are the legislative branch. We're the policymakers of the city. We want this information so that we can better understand how your agency works. And not that we don't trust that you'll give it to us, but we don't trust that you'll give it to us. And so we want to make sure that you give it to us. And this is how this tool is used. And I don't think we are inferior legislators or less trustworthy legislators than our counterparts at the state level. And I don't think that we should be deprived an utterly normal and reasonable budgetary power that our peers, that our colleagues exercise. And it's not just at the state level. There are other Maryland jurisdictions where this is done as well. And they are noted in our synopsis from the agency staff here.
And with respect to that, Mr. Chair, if I may, I think that, and you probably know, as a member of the government relations team, like I see these, like as we talked about this, I went as going through the state budget and seeing some of these conditions on the funds. But I think that whatever gives the General Assembly the authority to do this probably also takes into effect that there are almost 200 of them. There are 15 council members, right? And this is a way, I'm assuming, right, if this is power assigned to them, what, in the state charter, or like where do they get this authority to set conditions on appropriations? But it probably accounts for the fact that there has to be a way for the executive to be able to pass a budget, and in doing so, the legislative body is being able to do these conditional kind of conditions on these appropriations that allows for agreement. But if you keep going through this, there are some of these appropriations that have 2, 3, 4 pages worth of conditions before funds can be appropriated. And while this specific example that you use is only $100,000, there are there's one in there that's $6 million. There's one in there that's $3 million, right? It just depends on the member and how important the information that they're requesting is to them, that they'll increase that threshold in order to, get that information that they want from that respective agency. I also don't concur that this council is not powerful. If the council does not agree that it has the ability to have oversight.
Look, Bob has already stated on the record what he thinks those powers are that we use, and I've already disagreed with that, but it's already been put on the record what the administration thinks those powers are that we have that make it so that we don't need to be able to budget in this way. Councilman Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to super briefly just point out that anything that needs to get put in by a council member, and I think there's probably some concern that I would expect from the administration on this is like, hey, you're going to get a bunch of council members carving in specific things for their district, right? And it's kind of like a pork barrel on steroids type thing. That would make it really hard to effectively administer the government at a very large scale. I'm just going to point out that anything that's got to be put in there has to get through the council's process, right? It can't just be like me as if one council member, if I want $200,000 spent on X, like I actually have to get that I have to get enough of my colleagues on board with that for it to be above the veto threshold. So I think the things that the council, if there are things that the council could broadly agree on, like there's not an infinite number of those things. So I just think that that's being realistic about what we expect to see here is important. And I think that's important all around.
Thank you, Councilman Jones.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to highlight to the administration, sometimes when you're just being mindful of not supporting amendments that are reflective of what other jurisdictions do, but then being supportive of some other amendments, because it's what other jurisdictions do. And it's kind of a contradiction I hear sometimes where it's like, oh, we support this because it's common sense like the lowest bid, because it's what other jurisdictions do, it's aligned with other practices. But then when there's other amendments that is also aligned with other practices, there's not support for them because of certain things, like you said, because of fear that, people will abuse it or it may create delays, but that doesn't exist yet, right? And I would say it's just a contradiction sometimes. So I hear you when you say when it comes to, this amendment that it could potentially create delays or it could create, money being held up. But I think a lot of your concerns could also be addressed in the actual legislation of it, in the meat and potatoes of it. And I think right now we're just having the conversation of whether or not the council should have the authority, not necessarily what that authority should look like, where people aren't able to abuse it in the different concerns you have.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Councilman.
Let me add to this that, at the State General Assembly, they have the state treasurer as the person determining whether conditions have been met. That's a representative of the General Assembly. We're not even proposing that we should have that. The question was brought up, like, who makes the decision as to whether a condition has been met? In my estimation, in my understanding here, it's the finance director. It's the folks who are day-to-day in control of the outflow of money. If the administration were to say, we met this condition, release the funds, that would be it, unless we made some other sort of change. And we entrust that things will be done in good faith, that if you say you're gonna deliver a thing that respects the intent of the request, the condition, that would be done in good faith. And if it wasn't done in good faith, or if it wasn't done well, yeah, you'll hear about it from the council, or from the council member for whom, there was the impetus for it. But at the end of the day, we're not even proposing to create some gate where we're the ones deciding that the funds can or can't be released. And the only way, then, that it could possibly hold up operations, hold up business, is if the council, a reflection of the voters of this city, I might add, the council, as people trying to carry out the will and interest of the public here, were to set something unreasonable or unattainable, or at which, I trust that we're not doing. I don't see us doing things that are unreasonable or unattainable on a regular basis, and I've seen us keep members in check when they have supposed that we should do things that were unreasonable, unattainable, or flat out illegal. And so I think that we've demonstrated that, that we don't just let reckless things happen here, as I think the voters expect of us. And so then the only other thing that could keep things from continuing to work is if there was just no effort to meet the condition. And even in the opening remarks from MOGR, from Tyler, it was, referring to the budget as an important fiscal and policy tool. We're the policymakers, and the policy decision, if it happens to be it's going to be the policy here that this money doesn't get released unless this thing happens. That's a policy decision of the policy makers of the city. And that's why this is a common policy-making power. The budget is a policy document.
Yeah, but
I'm going to go to Councilwoman Ramos.
I have a new topic, so whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm going to ask Councilman Jones if he has a topic that he wants to bring in, or if we want to go to Councilman Blanchard. And
A topic that I would like to bring in is just, no new topic, right? It's kind of a general question, but I kind of wait till after we get through.
Okay, we'll go to
some of
Councilman
the
Blanchard.
topics.
Okay.
It's more of a general question, not topic specific, so I can wait till we go through the topics
Okay,
at the end.
cool, we'll do that. I know that you had wanted to bring something up at the beginning. I don't know if it's something that we've already touched on.
I can't remember what it was. If you can go to
Okay,
Councilman Ramos. again.
Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I very much appreciate all of these discussions. I wanted to go to the non-lapsing funds. And the reason that we wanted to make non-lapsing funds available through ordinance is, following the example of what we did with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund several years ago. That had to be established, not because it was the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but because it needed to be a non-lapsing fund, and we needed to have an ordinance to fund it. And so I'm curious, the way that at least I was thinking about this was that we could we could put an ordinance in place to create another, I'm just gonna use this as an example, an affordable rental housing fund, okay? Something a little bit separate. The act of creating the fund doesn't necessarily mean that the fund will be funded by the ordinance of estimates. We would still, it could be, right? It could be something that we all agree with and we want to put money into it. But we also wanted to make sure that we had the power to create funding sources, as we did for our original Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and put it into those funds. And so I'm curious as to some of the language in the bill reports around this objection to the funds assumes that if we create a fund, it has to be funded. And that would be the obligation of the mayor's office through the budgeting process to fund that fund, or it would be the obligation of the council to create a fund to put into it.
Yeah, and then I can start, and then Bob, if you want to jump in. But I mean, for us, it is because of the long-term fiscal impact, right? Non-lapsing funds are not neutral tools, right? They require ongoing and mandatory appropriations every year. I sat in at the tollgate table this year as we were working through the budget and listened to the Department of Finance tell the mayor and the city administrator and the chief of staff how much money was off of the table because it was fenced away in some of these, funds. Once you, and I would assume that the council would not want to pass a fund and expect it not to have money in it. I think I don't understand why you would do that, but the proliferation of these funds, again, to the point that I made earlier, starts to undermine the annual budget process that we go through, because then you lock away more and more and more and more and more dollars that takes those dollars off the table when the mayor wants to make a policy decision about whether to fund pools for the summer, make sure that we can still collect trash on time, add a new service to collect compost and yard waste, right? Because there are non-lapsing funds that have been passed by ordinance, which is a very low threshold, just 8 members, as opposed to allowing the voters to decide what city dollars should be locked away for specific and special purposes, and what city dollars should be left for their mayor and city council to prioritize based on their needs over the course of the fiscal year. And we really do believe that the threshold set by the charter is intentional in that we need to be deliberate when we make the decision to say that in perpetuity, X amount of dollars are off the table for anything other than this purpose.
So that is not what we mean by a non-lapsing fund. What we do not mean that we are taking a percentage of the budget and it automatically goes into this fund. That is not what we mean. What we mean is we will create, again, a non-lapsing fund like the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There is no money allocated from the general fund to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund at the moment. The only thing that's allowed that's attributed to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is a separate funding source that my colleague sponsored to go into that fund. And an agreement with the advocates and the council and the mayor at the time that a certain amount would go from the capital budget into that fund, and that was by agreement. So when the language that we have in here, and if we need to clarify it, I'm happy to do that, is not that we would say we want 10% of the budget to go immediately to affordable housing. That's just not what we're saying. What we're saying is we want to create the shell, if you will, of the fund, and then create funding sources to put. Now, we may want to negotiate with the mayor's office and say, everybody thinks that this fund is really important. We don't want to have to return funds at the end of the fiscal year. That's what non-lapsing means. We don't want to return funds at the end of the fiscal year, but we think this thing is really important, so we're going to all work together to figure out what the funding source would be. I think the other example is the Fair Election Fund, right? The Fair Election Fund was created as a non-lapsing fund, and I believe the funding source is general funds.
There is no recurring source of funding to the.
There's no recurring source of fund, right.
Which makes the point that this is not
right.
a continuous annual appropriation.
That is correct. So our intent, again, is not another BCYF or anything like that. Our intent was to create this fund that would allow for funds to be, if they weren't expended, to stay in the fund, and then that we would have funding sources or negotiate. So again, the language in the bill report is such that it assumes it would be an annual appropriation, and that wasn't our intent.
Our language does.
Bob, are you going to answer your question?
I do want to hear from the mayor's office, but I did see Bob.
So just a reminder, that Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we raise taxes to do that. So that's
yes,
one point, just to be clear.
I know.
And we're the highest tax jurisdiction, and we have the highest combined rate for transfer and recordation now because of that tax. So just let's be clear on that. And then I would also say separately, you're not going to create a fund unless you have an intent to put money into the fund, which is our fear. And I would also say the council has the ability to move money in the budget. So if you want to put money towards affordable housing, you can propose an amendment to transfer money within existing resources. Within existing resources, you can transfer money from one spot to the other. So again, a budget process says these are the resources, this is the resources we have, and that's driven by us to say this is what we legitimately have, and then the council can move money between priorities. But if you're creating a separate fund with the intent of creating a separate tax to fund that, I don't think that's in the best interest of the city overall.
I see what you're saying, although you can't assume that what we are going to be creating is an additional tax.
Well, how else would you get money into the fund then?
I mean, we have creative minds here. We can try to figure it out. I mean, what if we wanted to take all the revenues from the penalties that are collected after on all of our vacant properties and put it somewhere else? Or what if we wanted to do, there's other ways to come up with funding sources. It just happens to be that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is an additional yield tax over transactions over $1 million. So it's not like it's every property. So I hear what you're saying, but what we are saying is we may want to at some point have a fund that we don't have to give the money back at the end of the year or go through this spending frenzy trying to spend it at the end of the year in a very non-strategic way just to be able to make sure that, we use all the money. Like I've seen it where, oh, we got to spend this money, we're going to spend all, no, we want to be strategic about how we're spending money and be able to then have these funds and be creative about what a funding source might actually be. My colleague has another idea for how to be able to put a fund together and put some funding sources in it. And that allows us a lot more flexibility, and it gives the council a little bit more opportunity to fund our priorities, frankly. And so I think that's the intent of it. It's not to constrain, it's not to fence off, it's to be able to create something that we think is important, that we don't have to give the money back at the end of the year if it's not spent, and to be able to come up with funding sources. Nowhere in this language does it say that we would say 2% of the budget automatically goes there. That's just not what's on the table.
Let me just, I'm coming to you in just 1 second. I'll just add, look, again, I want to remind that as a deliberative policy-making body here, if the city council says, we think that as a matter of policy, this very small percentage of the transfer and recordation tax should go to the purpose of affordable housing because we believe affordable housing is really important to the people of this city and to the welfare of this city, and this is a reasonable way to continuously, reliably be able to generate that fund. That is a policy decision. That is a policy-making decision that we should have the ability to make. Even if you look at just general opinions on what is and is not appropriate charter material, these funds are not appropriate charter material. These special funds should not exist in the charter. They are essentially legislative acts. And the only thing that the charter is doing is saying that we can put money in a special thing. It is a legislative act. It is necessarily a legislative act even now that says money comes from a certain source to a certain use, with the exception of the Children and Youth Fund, which I would add is highly inappropriate charter material, and which had the council passed it, because if we remember what happened to establish the Children and Youth Fund is it was an act that originated with the council president, that it passed the council, it went to the mayor vetoed it, the council overrode that veto and sent it to the voters, and the voters approved of it. And had it not had to go all the way to the voters, had it simply been a matter of the council makes this policy decision to put this money to this use, and then the mayor vetoes it, and the council says, well, we're overriding that veto because we're the policymakers here. This council could be making changes to the Children and Youth Fund right now to make us more fiscally responsible if we believe that that's a fiscally challenging or irresponsible way to appropriate money. But we can't even do that right now. If we do this, then in the future, we create funds that are more reasonably and easily altered if they're found to be problematic. And it gives us the ability to establish these existing special funds in ordinance, in code, so that they can be repealed from the charter and don't have to stay there in the charter in perpetuity. And so I think it gives us a lot more flexibility as a city. Tyler has been trying to ask a question for a minute, and so I want to go to him.
Yeah, my question was for Councilman Ramos, but I feel like I probably got the answer just in all of the dialogue just now. But if you were to pass an ordinance to create the non-lapsing fund, right? Would you not want to ensure that it would be funded? And again, the non-lapsing nature of that fund is that if you say X amount of dollars or X percent of whatever needs to go into this fund, is that it goes there and it stays there. It never comes back over to the general fund, like at the end of the fiscal year, like most, dollars do, like they go to the agencies. That's like me going to the bank and opening up a bank account and knowing that I'm never putting money in it. The bank will then close that account, right? So like, I guess I just want to understand kind of the intent behind creating a fund that we won't put money in, and then, maybe finance wants to weigh in, but like the executive branch has, and I would argue the legislative branch as well, has a duty to be concerned about the city's creditworthiness, and how the folks that assess our creditworthiness look at how we are structured, and how we move money, how we create pots of money, how we subsequently end and get rid of those pots of money. That stuff matters to folks who are going to be loaning us money. You had better have a high bar for taking money off of the table when you need to be able to show me that you can handle your funds and that I can give you $1 billion in a loan, and that you have the money somewhere else to be able to pay that back, and not I'm giving you $1 billion and you got $1 billion in the lockbox. I'm probably not loaning you that money.
I hear what you're saying. I think that our intent is, and the way that we did the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the way that my colleagues have sort of thought about some of the things that they want to do, is for the whole package. Like, we're not, to your point, we're not going to create a fund if we don't know that we already have the money or we have an idea of how it's going to be funded. But we also know that, in the process of negotiation, the mayor still has veto, authority line by line if that's something that the mayor doesn't want to fund, if we wanted to fund it either through transferring, moving money around or by creating an ordinance. So I still think it's part of the process. And I think that, again, the whole point of non-lapsing, like if we were able, the whole point of non-lapsing is, again, with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we get money in this year in the preliminary budget. It's estimated to be $9.3 million. And sometimes it takes a minute to get the money out the door, right? We're spending that money. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund is extremely successful. We're producing units, we're helping families, and that's because that was a lot of dialogue and partnership between the mayor and the council and the advocates at the time. And so I would, want to put faith in the fact that we would do a similar process to be able to make sure that we're having those discussions, have agreement on a funding source. I'm still researching more ways to have more funding sources for that particular fund, right? And so I think that, again, it just, because it takes a minute sometimes to get the money out the door, we want to be able to make sure that it stays. Similar with, the capital budget, those are almost exactly like non-lapsing funds because you reserve the money for each year. Sometimes it doesn't get spent and it just stays there. And that's a larger conversation because I have a whole lot to say about the capital budget that we're not tackling this year. But I think that, again, it's a matter of being able to do that. And I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to make one last little comment on this, and then we're going to go to Councilman Jones. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 special funds established in Article 1 of the city charter. To my knowledge, there are appropriations or there are funding mechanisms or there are funds going to 3 out of the 11. One is the is Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which we established a recurring or continuous mechanism for by ordinance. One is the Children and Youth Fund, that is sort of problematic in nature in terms of how it's structured. And the third is the special fund for fair elections, which is done by non-recurring appropriation. An agreement was made a couple of years ago to put a certain amount into it for the last election, and there's, to my knowledge, no money in it, and there's no recurring source of fund going into that right now. The other 8 are just sitting there. And I would, I would venture to say that we would have fewer of these funds that on the books that come as just like one member's like pet project. That the council goes, hey, look, let's just pass the creation of this fund because whatever, it only actually goes there if the voters vote to approve of it, and there's no money attached to it. It's not like, it's just a place to dump money if in the future we decide to dump money into it. And so it's not the creation of the fund by charter that is the controlling issue here. It's whether we actually put money into it. And that's where we see, look, nobody is deliberating here right now to say like we should be putting money into these funds that the voters actually approved to create, right? We're not sitting here saying, because I think the reality is that people know that we would not agree on some funding mechanism that makes sense to go into any of these other 8 funds that we have the right now to do. And so I think that's evidence that we're not gonna just like create reckless, ways of cordoning off funds. But we should have the ability to consider doing this without having to put something into the city charter that has no place, that has no business being in a city charter. It is inappropriate charter material to have these funds there, period. Bob, I'll go to you, and then I'm gonna go to Councilman Jones.
So you're referencing 3 and then 8, but I can tell you at least for a couple of those other 8, there was an effort to try to come up with a recurring funding source to put in there that we had to push back on. I know the one was...
And the city council was reasonable enough to listen to that pushback, right?
Well, it depends on the item. I mean, there was a couple proposals to kind of raise taxes. One of them was on the energy tax, I remember.
Yeah.
There's probably some others, but I would go back to, in the budget, the council has the power to reallocate money from one priority to another. So if you want to spend money on fair elections, within existing resources that's presented to the council and say, this is what we have, you can move money from rec and parks to elections.
Sure.
You can move money from fire to DOT. So I guess it goes back to, I think it's a little bit, the idea of setting up a fund is clearly with the intent of trying to come up with a mechanism, probably through a new tax or revenue source, to fund that item. So if the idea is just to move money in the budget from another priority, you already have the power to do that. So I just think it's an unnecessary step, and it signals to me that there's, somebody's gonna wanna set something up, and then there's gonna be argument about dedicating a revenue source to that, which again, we think in a high tax jurisdiction, we just wanna make clear that we do not want to set up a situation where we're proposing new taxes when we're already the highest in the state in many of those items. So
I
that's just what I
understand.
wanna clarify.
I just think that, and I'm venturing to say that my colleagues think that as the policymakers, the legislators of this city, we should have the right to put that ability on the table if we think it's in the voters' interest, if we think that it's in the taxpayer and the city's interest to say this money from this source actually doesn't make sense to be going to things other than this kind of use. I keep saying I'm going to go to Councilman Jones, but he also said go to Councilman Blanchard before coming to him. And do you have a last note on this topic? We're changing topics.
No, I just want to say I get where folks are coming from. I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's probably worth saying that even though there's a desire to have the power to do this, doesn't mean that the council is just going to decide to start creating fund after fund after fund after fund. But again, I get the point that you're making in terms of fiscal conservative nature of finance, but also thinking about bonding agencies and lending as well in the perspective of the city. So I just want to put that out there.
Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This was the thing that I wanted to talk about when you were going to go to me originally.
No.
So I am a huge proponent of non-lapsing funds and have been, and I know had conversations with MOGR about one in particular. Let me use an example of why something that I think is an awesome idea and we need to do. And if we weren't introducing the non-lapsing fund charter amendment, I would have introduced this as its own charter amendment so we could have had this fund, right? So I want to allow parking meters in Main Street areas to run later and then use that revenue to fund improvements and whatnot in the main streets in the city, right? There's a lot of reasons why that's a great idea and we should do it. One really good thing about it policy-wise, a couple things. One, it very logically ties, right? You're able to tie like, here's where the revenue is coming from and it's going to this related thing, right? So politically, you're able to tell voters and tell people like, this money is going to this thing. Voters just feel way better about that than saying, this revenue is going to the general fund, right? And the idea, I think to Bob's earlier point, that we would just have to like fight repeatedly every year to get this into the budget is, I think, having been through, one budget cycle, that feels not realistic to me. That's that. And then I will say, adjacent to this whole conversation, while I think the Fair Election Fund is great and needs to, that one actually really needs to have an annual source because every 4 years we need to spend the money on it, right? And right now I'm the only member who's had the chance to use it. And if people are not confident the money's not gonna be in there, it's gonna make it hard for people to use. And I think that was a big discouragement for a lot of my now colleagues when they were thinking about, this, like, how do they know that there's going to be the money in there so that they can run the publicly funded campaign, which presumably we all, and I know the mayor supported this strongly when he's a council member, we should, I think we all want that to be on the table. And so there are some situations where like you need the assuredness of having that as well. And then lastly, I'll say that if you can legislate something in, you can also legislate it out. I don't have any, I think both the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and the Children and Youth Fund, both great. But if you did something that was dumb or you just didn't have the money available, you could then go back, and if we need to change it, then we can go back and change it legislatively and not by charter. So this is the one that I feel really strong about this one. I wanted just my opinion to be out there on that one. So,
yeah,
Mr. Vice Chair.
And Mr. Vice Chair, if I may, I think, Councilman, what you just mentioned is government working, right? The council has the ability to say, hey, this is a priority. And, if come time for the next election that this body says that like, we want to promote more people running for office and not having money be a barrier to serving or, people who believe that they are best positioned to serve our city, then you all can get together and move money around the budget to put money in that fund in preparation for that election. That is an ability that Bob has said it, I said it at the top of my remarks that, it's been some kind of uncertainty here around what authority the council has. And we think that the council has that ability to do it by being able to cut and move money in the budget. I would also say that, again, when you make the decision to create essentially a lockbox, there has to be a high threshold for that. And the voters should be the people to decide what money has to be set aside in perpetuity and for what use. You only need 8 council members to do that, right? With this, under this, you would need 8 council members to set up these funds, and then you go through the process of a possibility of a veto and whatever that looks like, right? But we just believe that higher threshold is important to have. And again, we are thinking about things like creditworthiness and the proliferation of such funds and what that could mean for our annual budget process. And that is kind of the thinking behind why we are at this time opposed to that specific amendment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to bring up a topic we probably all have some synergy on, which is the procurement. Seems like you all support it as well. I guess my question, what I wanted to bring up was a concern I've heard from the public while going to community listening sessions. I guess what we're proposing is removing the requirement where we can only accept lowest bid, removing that guardrail. I did hear concern from the general public and the community about if we're going to remove this guardrail, what are you replacing it with? And there are folks who are like, look, they may not feel comfortable with removing that guardrail without knowing, of only receiving the lowest bid without knowing what we're what we're considering. So while I know, the administration isn't the legislative body, but you all run the procurement office too, and you administer the contracts. I guess my question is, are you able to, and, are you willing to kind of work with us to ensure that we have some kind of outline and best practices and policies on what, the other example of maybe potentially best value would look like that we could potentially have if we no longer are locked into just a specific lowest bid only requirement?
Thank you for the question, council member. The answer is yes, of course. First, we'll need a little cash. It is budget season, so bring that on. But yes, of course, we'd be happy to work with the council to move that forward. In procurement straight up, traditionally, the lowest bid, which is known as an IFB, an invitation for bid, has always been the preferred method because it removes a person's prejudice. It's the lowest bid, the lowest dollar wins. Moving to the best value method is where moving the city to more of the RFP method, the request for proposal. During that RFP, we basically go out to the business community and says, the city has a business problem and we want you to help provide a solution. And we add criteria and scoring mechanisms in. Price can be a factor, but it's not the most important factor. So depending upon what it is, how complicated it is, budgetary concerns, we might say we will award 10 points for the lowest price. Or, and my preferred method is, we don't say what the price, we don't put price in because we want to just score and we want to get the best technical proposal. And then after we've ranked the technical proposals, enter into negotiations with that firm or that business partner where we can then negotiate price and scope and things of that sort. But yes, we are happy to work with you any way that you would like to get that going. But those are the traditional methods in a procurement shop how we move forward.
Thank you, because I think it'll be helpful to have some of that framework out in the public before they are asked to kind of vote on some of these things. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Adam, I would just love to implore that you and Councilman Jones and ask MOGR to help facilitate this. I'd really love to get this ball rolling. I know this has been a priority interest for Councilman Jones since day one on this council, and that we all want to see new standards developed, these alternative standards developed. We want to be doing this really well and collaboratively from the outset, and be led and work in partnership with our actual professional experts.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So let's set that up post haste. Thanks. Councilwoman Ramos.
I'd like to be included. Thank you.
Let's include Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you. And maybe this is a conversation for when we get this little group together. I think it's really important that we do because we're not just taking out lowest bid in our amendment, we're taking out all the administrative stuff that's in the charter too, because that's really hamstrung, I think, pretty much every department that's had to do procurement. And so I hope to see it in the code so that we can have a public discussion about this. Is that also your feeling? As opposed to regulations?
Yes, ma'am. It would be going into the code as an ordinance to move forward, and that would give us the flexibility then if we need to make changes to come back to the council to make those.
Great. I think we're on the same page then. That's great. Thank you so much. Yep.
Okay. I'm going to go to, we have one person here who has patiently waited to give public testimony. And so, Ms. Floyd, would you like to come up and give us? I think we are. Hit that red button or the right button there.
So now to give you all a perspective from the group, from within the group of people who are outside
Hang on
government.
we're going to give you 3 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure. We're supposed to be the most important people apparently in all this. So I know a couple other people are online who wish to speak. So for the record, what we've heard is that from this committee is that our charter should be more like that of our peer jurisdictions, but not that our charter should include the people's referendum power, even though that is a power that voters have in our peer jurisdictions. We have heard this committee say it will consider all potential charter issues between now and 2028, but I believe that no serious consideration will be given to adding the people's referendum power to the charter. This is because last night, the chairman made it clear that the committee believes city voters already have too much power. And his bill removes city voters' power to approve new non-lapsing funds, and the committee wants all that power to the city council. So if you believe that city voters have too much power and that city council doesn't have enough, that seems to be what I see in this bill. I see this bill trying to achieve to put something on the ballot in November that could manipulate us into voting against our interests. In this bill, I see elimination of key public protections for city residents on pages 5 and 7, deleting the charter requirement for the Board of Estimates to hold public hearings on the ordinance of estimates, page 16, deleting the charter requirement for public advertisements for proposals, page 26, deleting the charter requirement for public advertisements for franchises, page 25, deleting the charter requirement that an applicant for a minor privilege shall first serve copies of the application on the owners of the adjoining properties. That is huge. That's been in the charter for ages. Why would you not want the immediate neighbors to be the first to know? On page 24, deleting altogether the open public minor privilege approval process, which is now conducted by an open public body with a published agenda, and instead, the committee wants to give the approval power to someone sitting at a desk in some city agency. This is troubling. Now is not a time to be legislating against public awareness and public participation and public procedures, for the record.
Thank you. I'm not generally going to comment on things except that I've been kind of called out by name and misrepresented, so I'm going to clarify for the record that our proposal is not in any way to remove from the voters the ability to put forth a petition or anything to create non-lapsing funds in the charter, but simply that while that still remains a viable and allowable path, that we would also have the ability to establish non-lapsing funds by ordinance. Okay, we have some folks online. We're going to go to, who is the first person? Tell them if they want to be. Yes, if you'd like to be recognized to speak online, please raise your hand. Use the raised hand function in the WebEx app. I see Ms. Deb O'Neill has her hand raised, and we're going to unmute you, Deb. And you will have 3 minutes. We can hear you.
Thanks. I just want to express serious concerns about the process for this entire thing. I have been to a listening session. I opted not to go to the listening session last night because I'm not quite clear on why you would have listening sessions after you have already drafted your proposed legislation. You clearly have already made up your mind without input from the community as to what it is we want to do or what our concerns are. So I just simply want to say we're a little tired of this game that, yeah, we involve the community when in fact all the decisions are made before we get a chance to testify. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Carolyn Carey?
Thank you. This is Carolyn Carey. I'll be very brief. I do have an issue with the rush to get this done, to get it on the ballot for 2026. And I think that more time needs to be spent on the processes and how, the council, if these bills were approved, how are you going to get the work done if you don't have the people on the city council who can handle the work? And so I think that fix something after it's broken is a little bit, it's less than we would expect of our elected council people, that there should be a lot of thought to go into what you're doing and what backup plan that you have. So if it's your idea to do away with the Board of Estimates, what do you have in place? And if you want to reduce the power of the mayor, what do you have in place? That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carey. Can you show me the full list of people that are on there? Want to again ask if there's anybody online who wishes to testify to use the raise hand function, and we will call on you and give you 3 minutes. Okay, we're not seeing any more. So we're going to wrap up here. I want to express my thanks before we recess to the spirited conversation here. Welcome back after another session, Nina. How are you today? Yeah, tired. Understandable. Again, just thankful for all of the work of my colleagues here on the committee, of the people who participated in the many months of the committee's work, to all the people who have written to us and attended our listening sessions over the last couple of months, to our agency staff who diligently reported on this and came here very knowledgeable of these subjects to be able to have conversation with us, and for the work still to come. We will be back here 1 week from today, again at 1 p.m. And for now, we are in recess.
Never mind, I had a question.